Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going on a journey to uncover how ancient Israelites and Judahites thought about their deities. But here's the twist. We're adding in some insights from cognitive science. It's going to be a fascinating exploration of ancient beliefs, unseen forces, and maybe even a glimpse into how your own mind works.
It's fascinating to think about, isn't it? These ancient concepts actually connect with some pretty universal human experiences and have influenced how we think about religion even today.
Right. Okay, so for this deep dive, we're looking at excerpts from YHWH's Divine Images. It's a really interesting look at how people in ancient times used physical objects, rituals, and even texts to interact with the divine. But what really makes this book stand out is that it doesn't just stick to ancient history. It actually connects these ancient practices to cognitive science, specifically this fascinating concept called unseen agency.
Right, and for anyone who hasn't heard that term before, unseen agency is basically our brains being hardwired to sense, well, unseen agents. It's that feeling you get when you think something's watching you or when you hear a noise in the dead of night and your mind instantly jumps to, what was that?
I definitely know that feeling.
Yeah.
It's like that primal instinct that makes us jump at shadows.
Exactly. And while we might explain those feelings away with logic and reason today, imagine how ancient people must have felt. Back then, those same chills down the spine could easily be interpreted as spirits, as deities, as something bigger than themselves at play.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Without the scientific explanations we have today, they attributed those feelings to something more,
Yeah,
well, supernatural.
exactly. And what's really intriguing is how those ancient cultures, particularly in Mesopotamia, viewed the spirits of the dead and their deities. It's easy to assume a simple distinction, but they actually had completely different terms for things like body spirit, animating force, and even breath.
Wow. So they didn't just have one concept of a soul, they had a whole vocabulary. That's incredibly complex for a time when, they didn't even have electricity. It really makes you appreciate how differently they viewed the world back then.
It does. And it suggests that the lines between the living and the dead, the physical and the spiritual, were a lot more fluid for them. Think about it. Have you ever felt a strong connection to a place or object because it reminds you of someone you've lost?
Absolutely, all the time.
It's that same kind of connection, but on a much grander scale. They believed that those spirits, those unseen forces, were actively present and influential in their daily lives.
So we've established that ancient people were super tuned in to this idea of unseen agency, like you were saying, those spooky feelings that there's something more out there. But how did they go from this general sense of the supernatural to these specific deities with names and personalities and powers?
That's where it gets really interesting. You see, YHWH's Divine Images argues that deities weren't just figments of imagination, they served important social functions, almost like contracts in a way.
Contracts.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
Well, people expected certain things from their deities, right? Protection, guidance, maybe some good weather for the crops.
Right.
And in return, the deities had expectations of the people, influencing their behavior and shaping their society. It was a two-way street.
So it's like a give and take relationship. It's
Exactly.
not just about feeling a presence, but about that presence having a real impact on their lives.
Exactly. And a great example of this from the book is the concept of YHWH, the god of the Hebrew Bible, as a patron deity. So imagine deities as being like powerful influencers or even mascots for different groups of people.
Okay.
In many ancient cultures, certain gods were specifically associated with particular communities, offering them protection and favor.
So each group had their own divine representative,
Yeah.
kind of like a spiritual VIP.
Precisely. And get this. The book highlights that over half of the times the word deity pops up in the Hebrew Bible, it's actually directly connected to a specific person, group, or place,
Wow.
showing just how significant this whole patronage idea was. It wasn't just a background detail, it was central to their understanding of the divine.
Wow, it's like their deities were active participants in their society, not just distant figures in some other realm. But how do they actually interact with these deities? It's not like they could just send a text message or something.
Yeah, that's where things get even more interesting. This is where the material world really comes into play. The book talks about how ancient people relied on physical objects as a way to bridge that gap and connect with the divine.
That makes me think of those incredible stelae you see in museums, those massive upright stones covered in inscriptions. Did they play a part in this?
They sure did. Those stelae were much more than just memorials. In the book, the author suggests that they could actually represent deities themselves, particularly in places like burial sites, where the veil between the living and the dead felt thinnest.
So you're saying those stelae could have been seen as physical embodiments of the divine.
Exactly. And it's fascinating to think about how those beliefs might have evolved over time. In the beginning, a stela might have been a symbolic representation, a way to honor a deity. But as time went on, people might have started to believe that the deity's presence actually resided within the stela itself. It became a physical manifestation of their power.
That's amazing. It's like the stelae acted as a kind of conduit between the physical and spiritual worlds.
Mm,
And that makes me think of another incredible artifact, the Ark of the Covenant. It's like the ultimate example of an object believed to be imbued with divine power, right?
hmm.
It's incredible to think about how these ancient cultures used physical objects to connect with their deities. But it wasn't just about these grand, imposing structures like stelae or the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
You're absolutely right. YHWH's Divine Images looks at all sorts of ways ancient people incorporated this idea into their lives. Like one fascinating example they discuss is this inscription, the Kerbet El Kom inscription. They found it in a tomb,
Yeah.
and it basically features this plea for protection, directly addressed to a deity. But here's the interesting part. Right below the text, there's a hand symbol carved into the stone.
A hand symbol.
Yeah, like they were trying to reach out and touch the divine.
That's one way to think about it. It's as if by carving that hand symbol, they were imbuing the inscription itself with power,
Yeah.
making it a bridge between the physical and spiritual realms. So it wasn't just a message, it was a direct line.
It's like the inscription itself became a sacred object, like imbued with the power to channel that protective energy.
Exactly. And this idea of channeling power through the written word, it gets even more fascinating when we start thinking about the power of a deity's name. We see this all over the Bible, where even speaking the name of God was taboo. It's like the name itself held a certain power, almost like a magical charm.
Right, like even uttering the name could have these unintended consequences.
Exactly. And for another example, there are these tiny scrolls called the Tiffinum silver scrolls, and they were found in a burial site. And get this, they actually include the name YHWH written on them, almost like a blessing, or a form of protection for the deceased.
So it's like they believe that inscribing the name of their deity on an object, whether it's a massive stela or a tiny scroll, could imbue that object with a piece of the divine.
Precisely. And what's so fascinating here is how this idea connects to a broader shift in how the divine was understood over time. Like as beliefs evolved, even sacred texts like the Torah could be seen as embodying divine presence. It's like that power once associated with physical objects shifted to the written word.
It's like they went from worshiping at physical shrines to finding that same sense of the sacred within the pages of their holy books.
Exactly. And it really makes you wonder, if we were to try and create something today that represents the divine, what would it be? Would it be a physical object, a work of art, a specific location, or maybe even something entirely different, like music or code?
Mm, That is such a thought-provoking question. It really makes you realize that even in our modern world, we're still searching for ways to connect with something larger than ourselves. To make sense of the unknown, just like those ancient Israelites and Judahites did thousands of years ago. Well, that was an incredible deep dive. We explored this fascinating world of ancient beliefs, peeked into how our own brains perceive the unseen, and even uncovered how those ancient ideas still resonate with us today. Thanks for joining us, and remember, there's always something new to discover.